I'd like to show a simple example that illustrates how Visual Studio Team Services can support non.NET environments and also integrate with and work with other tools that are outside the Microsoft stack. So to give you a simple example, I'm going to run all of this from the Mac, first of all, so we won't use a Windows development box. I'm going to be working on a Java project, and I've got just a simple example here. We just got some code. It's a very simple web application, JSP-based Java web application that relies on a MySQL database. And although you can edit this in Eclipse, we're going to be working with this here, integrated in with Visual Studio Team Services. The source control repository is actually sitting in GitHub. So let's just go and have a look at that. So this is the GitHub repository where we can find the source code. So all of this is sitting inside here, and we're going to submit any changes into this repository. So you can see the same classes that are sitting in here. So this is what we're going to work with. Let's go back here. Is the source code sitting in here. The application itself, very straightforward. We can come in, log into our application, just put my password in, and that will allow us to go and have a look at a dashboard and to access our fares, so the history of what basically travel that we've booked within this. So a simple application. The application itself is deployed into Tomcat. So if I go in on this machine, here's the Tomcat Web Application Manager, and we can see at the moment I've got what I've called my shuttle dev. So the dev environment I've deployed as a WAR file into this machine. And so what I want to do is to automate the process of making a change, which gets pushed via Git into GitHub. That then kicks off a build. And the build engine that we're using here is Jenkins. So I've set up a Jenkins build configuration for this project. So we can come in here, have a quick look at it. This is running on a Linux box, and we can see that this is configured to go in and get and is hooked up to basically my Git repository sitting in GitHub. So this is a Jenkins build that we can then queue up. And we're going to extract the WAR files afterwards. So how can we tie this together, and what do we get out of that? Well, ultimately what I want to look at is, here's the Visual Studio Team Services, or one of the dashboards. I've just created this one, and I've put a few build widgets and release widgets on there. So basically we can keep an eye on the success of that build. We can also keep an eye on the releases as they go out. And so let's just have a quick look at those before we kick things off. If I go into the builds themselves, I've configured a build, this one here, and let's go and edit it, just so you can see it. And you'll be able to see how simple this is. This is simply a build, and really what it's doing is just looking for events. And this one is saying when I've seen a GitHub event, when we've committed to that GitHub repository, then go and kick off this Jenkins job. So go and run the Jenkins continuous integration. And what we're going to do here is also just wait for that to complete. And so we'll be able to track from, although we'll be handing over the build to Jenkins, what we'll be doing is waiting and reporting on the success or failure of the build taking place in Jenkins, which is both the compilation itself and also running unit tests. So this is a simple handover to Jenkins. Jenkins will then after it's completed, basically we'll kick off the release. And so I've set up here what I've called my shuttle.pipe. And inside here, what we're then going to do, I've chosen to deploy this Linux Tomcat instance into Azure. And so I'm going to use Azure Resource Manager. In other words, I'm going to use JSON templates to deploy this. So this is actually going to provision the environment, which is the Linux VM with Tomcat and MySQL. that will all get created. So there's a number of options here, but I'm going to create or update that resource group, and I've passed in the scripts and parameters that are being used there. A little bit of config, but then having done that, I'm then going to deploy the WAR file into Tomcat running in that machine. So we'll get the latest version that was built in Jenkins, and in the development environment I'm going to deploy it under the context of my shuttle dev. So I'm using one machine, which is a little bit artificial, but to save me having lots of VMs, but these would typically be separate machines or environments. In the QA environment I'm doing exactly the same thing. The only difference is I'm deploying that to a QA application context, and then I've gone on to UAT, and I'll deploy that into UAT, and of course we could have as many environments as we like. So this could go on to pre-prod, prod, etc., however many you want. So that's the basic structure of what we're using. So in just a quick summary, we've got a Java-based project in Eclipse, source code sitting in GitHub. Visual Studio Team Services is going to identify when a commit takes place in GitHub and then hand that over to Jenkins. When Jenkins completes, we'll then kick off the release that we're looking at now, and the release will deploy the WAR file into the Tomcat instance, and then go from environment to environment. The other thing I should probably just quickly add in there is that I've also added in approvals. So when we go development, we'll deploy to automatically, but we won't deploy to QA or UAT until certain users have approved it, and we'll see that as we go through the flow. So that's the kind of the basics in there. So let's go and have a look at, in fact, let's put this back on. That's fine, we'll keep it there for the moment. We'll keep an eye on our builds. But let's start this off and say, well, maybe we're starting with we've got a card, something like the change dashboard title, and I can go in and have a look at the details. I haven't put very much in there, but we're going to change the title of the dashboard, and so I might indicate that we're going to work on that by changing it to the in progress column. Within Eclipse, I can also go and access these work items. So I can go, I've created a query here just called My Priorities, and we've got the change dashboard title. So I can open that up and work on it. I can see that information and progress it here as well. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change it's just very simple, but I'm just going to change the dashboard title. So let's change that from your dashboard to my dashboard, and we'll go and let's go and save that. And what I want to do here is we're going to push that up now. I'm going to do this in one hop, but I'm going to go into the team options and we're going to do a git commit. And I'm going to say that I've changed the dashboard title. And what I'm going to do, rather than just do a local commit and then separately go and push it, just so we get that done in one go, is let's just go and commit and push in a single push. So that's now gone up onto GitHub. If I go back into the browser, let's go and have a look. If we come back in here, have a look at the latest commits. There's the one that I've just added in, so we can see this is now sitting inside GitHub. If I go back to our build area, we can see that a build is now in progress. Let's go and have a look at it. And what's happened here is I'm using our hosted build agent. So this is the agent that's available in Azure. So I haven't had to create a build machine, although you can do that, and you can have your non-hosted agents, private agents. So in this case, I'm looking at the log, and what this has done is kicked off the Jenkins build. So if I go back to Jenkins, and we come in here, we can see that there is a Jenkins build now working through. So this is currently in progress. So if we go back over here, keep an eye on it. If you remember, I'd said that we'd selected the checkboxes to say that when the Jenkins, watch this Jenkins build and tell me when it's succeeded. So we can now see that for this particular build, these are the changes, and in fact if I click on those, they'll take me back into GitHub, and they'll also show me what's going on in Jenkins. So that'll open up the Jenkins build. So those links from the build log are taking me back to that. This was successful. And so the next step in that process is if I go into the releases, we can see that this has kicked off release 38 here. And so let's dive into that. And we can see that the deployment to the dev environment is now in progress. And again, we can see the artifacts that are coming across. We've brought in the war file from Jenkins. I'll show you where that was set up in a second. And again, if you want to, you can go and have a look at the logs. And we can see that we're going through the steps here. And currently we're doing the provisioning of that Tomcat instance. So this is actually, in this case, the virtual machine itself has already been provisioned. So in this case, it's doing a create or update. So here it's just doing an update, and that's really just to make it a bit quicker. We could delete all of these entirely, but this step does take several minutes if it's provisioning from scratch. In this case, it should be a lot quicker because the environment is already there. But what it's doing is then going through and checking that the Linux VM exists, that it has Tomcat on it, and appropriately configured, so in particular passing in the appropriate username and password and setting those up in the Tomcat users XML, and then also ensuring that the MySQL database is there and that it's appropriately populated with things like the usernames and passwords and the example data like the fare history that's there. So here it's finished that provisioning and checking. And then the final step will be to deploy the new war file into Tomcat. So that's been deployed. So that's successful. So we've gone through the development environment, so we can see that's there. If I go back up to the history, we can see that that's gone green. This little clock icon here is indicating that it's not going to deploy to the QA environment until approval is reached. And if I go back for a second to the build log, and we look at the build that just kicked off, you can also see that we can track this from the build as well. So you can watch the releases here. But what I'm going to do is let's go and approve. Well, let's go and have a look at it. In fact, let's go first of all back into the application, and let's just refresh that. Take a second while it recompiles. Let's go in, log in, and I'm going to check. Oops, helps if I get the login right. There we go. So I can go in there and I can see that the change I wanted is there. I've changed the title from your dashboard to my dashboard. So as a result of that, what I may well do is come in here and say, well, actually, I'm happy to say that we can continue this deployment out to QA. So obviously this is a little bit simplistic. You may well do a lot more than this, but I can say this is now approved for QA. And you notice that you can defer. So I could say that we're happy to do this, but we don't want it now. I want it later on, the weekend, or another day, for example, a particular time. But in this case, I'm going to kick off the deploy to QA. Just while it does that, what I'll do is if I go back in here, let's just have another tab. If I change this and before it gets to that deployment, just to kind of prove the point, if I go in and say let's go to my shuttle QA, it doesn't exist yet. And if I look at the Tomcat manager and we list our applications, then I don't have my shuttle QA. So the end result of the next step, as it goes through here, will be to create the next environment. So let's go back in, and we can see that it's going through the same process, but for our QA environment now. And so it's going through, and again we're back at the provisioning the virtual machine that has Tomcat and MySQL sitting on it. So I'll let it complete to there. While it's doing that, what I'll do is let's go back to, in fact, let's go to our dashboard. And we can see now that in fact the very last build was this build. So this is the build history. So we can see I've gone from I was playing around with things, gone from failing to partial success to more consistent success. I've put on a custom widget, which is a little traffic light, just shows the last build, 643, was successful. And then this release widget is reflecting where we are at the moment, which is that the latest release, release 38, is currently deployed into development environment and it's in progress in QA. But if we look at the UAT environment, that's still got the previous release on it. So we can see that we are where we are, which is that we are in the process of deploying release 38, and currently it's in the QA environment. So let's go back in, see where we're getting to on that. So we're still working through that one, and in a minute I think that will finish, and I'll show you that that's been added as an additional application inside Tomcat in this particular example. So it's just about to do that, I think. There we go. Last couple of steps. And of course what's powerful about this is infrastructure as a code or configuration as code. This is the provisioning in a repeatable way of your environments based on templates, in this case JSON templates. So this is now deployed into QA. I'm going to I'll jump the gun a bit, assume it is all right, but let's kick off the deployment for production. UAT, sorry, in this one. So proof UAT and kick that off. But what I'm going to do is let's go and look at the applications that are here. So that's now added in my shuttle QA. And if I go back in, let's change that and go to the QA site, we now have an application. So it had redeployed to the dev site and then put a new instance of QA in. And again, I can go in. Let's try and get the password right this time. Log in and we can see that those changes have been reflected here, etc. So we know we've got an application that's working in UAT, and then I'll leave this to continue the process, but it's now working through the deployment into the UAT environment. Last couple of things really just to quickly talk about in here is that at any of these steps we could add in additional tasks. So for example, we may well include Selenium tests, web tests to run against this, or maybe even things like load tests in different forms. That can be our own tools, so the Visual Studio load and performance testing tools, or tools like Apache JMeter. You can see that we support both Selenium as well as, again, our own functional testing tools, Coded UI. And if you look at things like utility scripts, essentially if you can script it, then you'll be able to put it in here. So I've used some of the Jenkins tasks, but there are also PowerShell tasks, shell scripts. As long as you have a way of building this, then you'll be able to do that. And you can see that although I've used Jenkins here, we could do all of this within Team Services. So in this case, this was a Maven-based Java project that's being built in Jenkins, and we support that entirely within Team Services. So we've actually delegated this to Jenkins, but we could have done it ourselves with Maven and run the unit tests and taken it all the way through this process as well. So if I go back to our deployments, let's just refresh that. You can auto-refresh these dashboards, but just want to make sure we've got the latest status. We can see now that this is deploying to UAT and that we're green in Dev and QA. So hopefully that gives you a view of how we can operate with these different tools. If we go back briefly to things like the artifacts, this is where are we getting information from. You can see that when you say I want to link to an artifact source, you have a choice of going directly. Build is our build system. You can go directly to either Git or GitHub, or Team Foundation version control, or you can go and get your artifacts from Jenkins, which is what I've done here. So in this case, I'm getting my artifacts from Jenkins, and I'm picking up the WAR file directly from that source. And if we go to the builds, as I showed you, if we go in and edit these, this one I'm just creating or delegating to Jenkins, but again in exactly the same way you'll see that we can also support pretty much any kind of technology and platform. So we have all of these tasks which are all available on GitHub and that you can create your own for and extend them yourself. So a good general suggestion. If you can't see a task that you need, go and look at the marketplace. There may well be things there. If there still aren't, then you can create your own, and you can just create things based around a script. So if we come back in, let's just see how we're doing. And we can see that we've now successfully deployed our change. So we edited in Eclipse, committed it to GitHub. That kicked off a team services build, which delegated to Jenkins, which then ran our release, which deployed to Tomcat, and then repeated that process across 3 environments, but there could be any number. So I hope that was a useful overview, and to give you some idea of the power and extensibility that team services provides around build and release.